Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And we are two lifelong friends with a combined 25 plus years of experience working and teaching on Wall Street, here to give you the skinny on the highest paying careers, Suits edition. Because that's right, this is our long-awaited Bankers versus Lawyers podcast. So for so many hardworking, ambitious people, the three careers that have historically been the trifecta of quote unquote good jobs are doctor, banker, and lawyer. And as you guys know, we already did a Doctors versus Bankers podcast. It's episode 47 if you haven't listened to it, and it's definitely worth a listen, by the way. And today we're going to sit down with two incredibly high-profile lawyers to learn about their career path, their lifestyle, the compensation structure, and the intersectionality between law and high finance. Kristen, I know we've talked about this a million times, but most of us have learned about law from watching TV shows like obviously Suits,
yep.
Law and Order, The Good Wife. What's the one
Boston
you like?
Legal. Boston Legal.
Yeah,
so
I never watched that one. But it's funny, right? Because in the 1990s, being a lawyer was like the notoriously evil profession, right? Do you remember like Liar Liar with Jim Carrey? And then I think in the first 2 decades of the 2000s, it was investment bankers.
I was going to say,
to them. And now I think private equity is everyone's favorite corporate villain. I mean, I know I personally flirted with the idea of law as a career. And I think a lot of the thought leaders that we've interviewed in the industry did as well, or came from law. We get asked dozens of questions pretty much daily from people who are currently practicing law who want to transition into finance. And our two interviewees have worked on some of the most high-profile deals literally of all time, which we'll get into here in a second. So this should be an episode that resonates tremendously with all of our listeners.
Yeah, well, I also think there is a huge difference between some of the types of law you can do, which is not corporate law. I mean, I think a lot of people want to transition to banking because they see it as a more lucrative field. And actually, like, that's not the case anymore. We actually get into that. But so we're going to be talking to two attorneys today, Jake Kling and Roshni Cariello. And Jake is actually someone I've known for almost 20 years. So he is married to one of my very close college friends, his amazing wife, Allie, who actually shout out to her because when I initially approached Jake and Allie about having Jake come on the podcast, Allie was the one who suggested getting Roshni on because Jake is a M&A corporate lawyer and Roshni works as a capital markets corporate lawyer, which are two very different things. It's like saying M&A investment banking versus capital markets, right? Like two different things. And so we're really excited to bring them on. We are so excited to be joined today by two incredibly talented and successful lawyers. We have Jake Kling, who is an M&A lawyer at Wachtell Lipton, and Roshni Cariello, who works at Davis Polk, focusing on capital markets. So to kick things off, I'd love if you guys could each walk us through your background, how you got interested in law, and then how you came to specialize in the areas that you did. So let's go ahead. Let's start with you, Jake.
Great. Well, thank you for having us. It's great to be with you. I went to Brown with Kristen. I studied math and economics. I actually thought I was going to go into finance. I spent a summer at what was then Merrill Lynch, and now B of A Merrill, in the M&A group. And it was a great job. I loved that summer. I'm still close friends with several of the people from that class. What I found when I was doing my summer analyst job was that the most interesting thing for me that I worked on was a defensive profile. So analyzing a company's structural takeover defenses, which is kind of one of those hybrid investment banking, but really largely a legal analysis. And so that got me interested in corporate law and maybe being an M&A lawyer. And then I decided to apply to law school. And while I was in law school, I went to Yale for law school. I took an M&A class taught by a guy who was then a Wachtell partner. And I ended up loving the class. I came to the firm as a summer associate and then came back and have been here ever since. That's my path.
Awesome. And then Roshni, if you can also walk through how you got into the area you did, your schooling, and what you do now.
Of course. And thank you for having us. So I went to Dartmouth. I then worked in management consulting for a couple years and then went to law school at Columbia. And so I always had a sense that I wanted to go to law school. I was a government major in college, but I wanted to get some work experience first. And I actually loved consulting, but I still had this idea that I wanted to practice law, and that led me to Columbia. When I got there, I kind of solidified this idea that I wanted to practice at the intersection of business and law. And that's eventually how I became a capital markets lawyer. And what I loved about consulting is actually what I love about what I get to do today is every project was an opportunity to learn about a new company, its industry dynamics, its market drivers, and evaluating its strategic objectives. And to be an effective disclosure lawyer and securities counsel, you have to do exactly those same things. So that's kind of how I found my way to my current practice.
Oh, that's so cool. And it's funny because you guys are obviously both under the umbrella of corporate law, but I feel like what you guys do on a day-to-day basis is probably quite different, or maybe not. And so can you walk us through a little bit of what it means to be specialized in M&A versus capital markets? Like, what are the types of deals that you're working on? And what is the day in the life like?
Yeah, I'll take a shot and then Roshni will correct everything. So, first of all, within law, there's a million different types of law that you can practice. Roshni and I do a very specific kind of subset within corporate law, which is transactional based rather than litigation. So we don't go to court. We don't do what I'm going to date myself, but
it's not law and order.
Law and order.
Like,
it's not law and order. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
Exactly. So we do deals. We do transactions, much closer to what investment bankers do that you've had on the show. I think the difference, and Roshni and I have worked together on deals, by the way. So it's not that different, right? Because we've been kind of co-counsel on things in the past.
I was going to say on the same side or opposite sides.
Both. Yeah. But I mostly do M&A, and I do dabble in a little bit of capital markets, but usually I just call Roshni when I need to know the answer to a capital markets question. But the main difference in my mind is M&A is primarily control transactions. So one company merging with another or acquiring control of another, whereas capital markets transactions is a company raising capital, usually a minority investment in the company through the public market. So that could be an IPO, it could be a bond offering, issuing securities, but not selling control of the company, typically. So there are differences, but there's a lot of similarities. Both practices involve the federal securities laws. So I do a lot of public company M&A. So, one public company buying another, or a public company being bought by a private equity firm. And the SEC regulates that. Roshni does a lot. I'll let Roshni comment on what she does, but a lot of IPOs and capital raising transactions where you're filing registration statements with the SEC. So there's a lot of overlap too.
I was going to pipe in because you get to work on like really cool deals. Like that's the other thing that's, when you're in banking, it's like you get to work on these deals that are like front cover. I mean, I think, Jake, were you on the Live Golf like PGA merger? I feel like it was like, I don't know if that's public or like
it's not a merger for the record, but yes, I represented the PGA in connection with the Live Golf discussions, but also they took an investment. This is an example where what I just said is not actually always hold. So the PGA Tour took an investment from a consortium called the Strategic Sports Group, which is sort of this combination of very high profile sports team owners that came together, pooled capital, and made a minority investment in a subsidiary of the PGA Tour. So I represent the PGA Tour in that. Yeah, so that's not your everyday deal. It was fascinating. But there's a lot of headline making deals. And then there's plenty of smaller deals that never make the Wall Street Journal, but are often as difficult or more difficult than the famous ones.
Yeah, Jen always talks about, because she does real estate in her spare time, and it's like the teeny houses are the most painful to deal with versus like, the multi-million-dollar ones are
totally.
They're a piece of cake. Roshni, if you can also jump in on what your day-to-day is like as well.
So I advise on like full spectrum of debt and equity financings, but also in connection with that, I do public company advisory work. So ongoing disclosure advice, which includes SEC reporting obligations, corporate governance matters. So my day is actually pretty varied, similar to what Jake was saying. So it could be a drafting session for a transaction, which is where we help craft a company's equity story, working very closely with the company's management team and its investment bankers, talking about when they go to market, how they're going to position the business, how they're going to talk about its strengths and strategies. And a lot of that really draws upon the business underlying fundamentals. And so it's law, and it's thinking about the securities framework as you're developing that, but you're also kind of really getting in the weeds in the business itself. And then, conversations with companies' boards of directors, advising general counsels on how to think through a thorny disclosure issue that may come up, working on structuring of the transactions. And so it's a pretty varied day. No 1 to 2 days look alike. So it's a fun practice.
Are you dealing with all different sectors, or in the sort of banking world, you become a tech specialist or power and utilities, or is it all different industries?
So I think in my practice, we're sector agnostic, but we all have our majors and minors, which develops as your career develops. So I do a lot of work in the consumer retail space, tech, clean tech, industrials. So varied, but we develop areas over time.
Got it.
I would say that's a big difference between investment banking and the law. The law is specialized, but it's not industry specialized the same way. And if you're a capital markets lawyer, an M&A lawyer, you can do deals in every industry. I mean, I do deals I represent banks and financial institutions. I represent tech companies. I represent retail companies, industrials. You wouldn't have a banker. I mean, there are M&A bankers who are execution people who will cross industries, but in general, there's much more specialization, I think, within a particular industry, and a bank is valued, right, a different way than a tech company. Banks valued based on their balance sheet, tangible book value multiples. Tech companies are valued based on future revenue. I think for a lawyer, there are some industry differences, but it's much more transferable across industries.
And question, so how do the skills and character traits differ? And also, do you need to know much about valuation? I remember when I used to work, we would go to law firms and we would teach some of the basics of valuation. And I remember some people be like, oh my God, I never knew that. And I thought that was so interesting. So what are some of the skill sets, and then again, the character traits, and what should someone know going into this type of a role?
So I do think those kind of the fundamentals of accounting and corporate finance are really valuable. Now, do you need to know it on day one? Probably not. I think so much of what you learn in the practice of corporate law, specifically, you learn on the job. Law school doesn't really prepare you for the practice of corporate law. I think it's very oriented towards being a litigator. But it's kind of essential to what we do. You can't really appreciate a strategic objective if you don't understand, again, the basics of what the company is driving for, how the company is valued when you're thinking about the broader transaction. In terms of skills, right, so you need a very strong technical foundation. You need that substantive knowledge base to be creative, to come up with out-of-the-box solutions for your clients, which is really what we get hired to do, right? We're working on the most complex transactions, difficult problems for our clients. But you also need to be commercial and pragmatic. Theoretical right answer is not always the practical right answer. It's like a weighing of risks and balancing that. And that's our job to help our clients think through that balance and coming to the right answer for the business at the time. Having high EQ, how to read a room, like those soft skills are just as important as the technical skills. How you communicate, how you deliver advice, how you deliver unpopular advice. And then the trait that I will call out, and I'm curious Jake's take on this too, which is a little bit different in our practices, is capital markets is fundamentally a very collegial, collaborative practice, right? So whether you're representing the company raising capital or the investment banks on the other side, facilitating the offering, your end goal is the same, which is a successful execution for the client. So everybody's rowing in the same direction, and it's in your interest, right? You're representing your clients, but you're all working together towards the same outcome. And so it's kind of friendlier in nature.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have always thought of the practice of law as being this head-to-head, I'm going to outwit the other side. But in some cases, you guys are effectively just acting as agents in their best interests of getting the deal done. And you all want to get to the same place. I honestly never really even thought about that aspect of it until you just said that.
I would say Roshni is totally right. I mean, I do think, though, it's an area which, consistent with what Roshni has said, where capital markets is a little different than M&A, because in capital markets deals, there is this sense, whether it's actually true in extreme, there are cases where not everyone's on the same side in a capital markets deal, but in general, the deal's going to happen. Everyone wants it to be successful. The investment bank, the underwriters have a relationship with the company. They very much want the deal to be successful, or it'll be the last offering they ever do for that company. And so there is kind of an everyone's swimming in the same direction. On an M&A deal, you want the deal to be a success and get done, but there's a risk allocation that's being negotiated in the merger, in the contract, right? There's a little bit of a zero sum game. And so on the scale of sort of adversarial to non-adversarial, probably capital markets is close to the non-adversarial end. M&A is a little more adversarial. Litigation is obviously much more adversarial than both of them.
Very interesting. So can you talk about the process of like applying to law school? And then once you're there, what internships look like and full-time jobs and the path of moving up through the firm once you've landed the job? You have a college student who wants to be a lawyer. Like, how do they now become a lawyer?
Bearing in mind that our experience is a couple decades stale on this.
Okay.
I think it's still the case that the most important thing is getting into a good law school, which is important because more so than college, there's a little bit of, I don't know, elitism is the right word, but for better or worse, probably for worse, where you go to law school has a disproportionate impact on what the opportunities are that come out of it.
That's like the whole plot of Suits, right?
Well, I was going to say, yeah.
Did you go to Harvard or not? They're litigating that for the first 3 seasons, whether or not he actually went there. Who cares?
But it's interesting because that's actually how it is with business school too, is the type of thing where it's like, if you weren't going to get into the top 3 to 7, the value of that degree is just like greatly diminished. And it's unfortunate, but it's the reality.
Well, I feel like you get so much more pigeonholed in law. You can go to a non-Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Dartmouth, et cetera, but you're going to stay in that local market then for law. So if you go to a law school in Wisconsin, you're going to be a lawyer in Wisconsin. You're going to have a lot more trouble finding a job at a big law firm in New York, let's say.
Isn't your best friend a lawyer in Wisconsin, Jen?
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, and again, I think we're speaking in generalities. You can always break out and get a great job. And I think if you look at top lawyers across New York firms, there's a mix. There's plenty of people from Columbia and Harvard and Yale, but there's plenty of people who didn't go to those schools. But the reality is it's that much harder to break in the first instance because firms are a little myopic and probably a little lazy, and they tend to go to the schools that they're used to going to. So the objective, I think, should be go to the best law school that you can get into that financially makes sense for you. And at least back when Roshni and I were applying, but I think it's still the case, the most important criteria to getting into law school is grades and your LSAT score. And there's other soft things that they look at too, but those really are, you can get a pretty good sense for what the possibilities are in terms of where you might get in based on those two metrics.
Got it. And then what does the internship, do you have to have an internship your first year in law school? And then that's going to pretty much set the stage for where you get a full-time offer? Or how does that?
So your first year internship, I think it's pretty varied across the board what people do. It's really the second year internship that matters, and particularly if you want to go into big law. And most law schools have a process, or at least large law schools have a process for facilitating placement into large law firms. And so it's the beginning of your second year. You usually go through like an on-campus interview process, or it's coordinated through the law school's career placement office. And you basically go through like a couple days of interviewing back to back at firms, and then you get called back at certain firms, and you go do on-site interviews, and that is the process where you get your 2L internship, and that 2L internship is usually the one that determines where you're going to go back and practice after you graduate law school. And some people do work at firms their 1L year. I didn't. I actually worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Jake, I actually can't remember what you did.
Me too.
Same, right?
Yeah, same thing.
And so, tried my hand in the world of litigation. It was not for me. So went to Davis Polk my 2L summer. I only did corporate work and then came back as a corporate lawyer, obviously. But it's a pretty defined process, at least in terms of the 2L internship process.
One thing that has changed since Roshni and I went through this is the law schools have become much more particular in terms of how they allow the recruitment process to play out. And they have pushed the interview process earlier and earlier. And so I think the way it works now at a lot of the schools is you interview for your second summer before you even start your first summer. And
so it's just like banking.
Everything's
going in the same direction.
Yeah. So the high schoolers are good to listen to this because they probably should start applying to law firms.
It's the same.
Seriously.
It's the same thing.
It's not.
One thing I do want to say, because I totally forgot this when I was asking, I was like, oh, your internship, your first year matters. I forgot that law school is a 3-year thing. So business school is 2 years. Law school is 3. It's like 1L is the first year, 2L, 3L. Anyway.
Roshni, you mentioned something in there that I think is a term that's commonly tossed around that may not be common parlance for our listeners and certainly isn't for me. What is big law? We talk a lot about the different categorizations within the financial services industry. You've got bulge bracket, elite boutique, lower middle market, blah, blah, blah. I hear the term big law all the time. Who are the players in big law? What is little law? Like, what's the difference?
Totally fair. I mean, I think it's just categorization of large law firms. A lot of Wall Street firms, I think, is the genesis of it. So when you're talking about like bulge bracket banks, you're talking, it's like the equivalent for big law.
Is all of big law in New York City? Is big law in LA and San Francisco too, and Chicago? Like, is there geographic density to these different categorizations?
I mean, there are firms that are based out of California, Chicago, et cetera, that also kind of fall into the category of big law, but then they have, I mean, they're global law firm that do, it's a similar profile of work.
We're New York centric snobs, so we only think of it as New York. But I think there are big laws, to my mind, it's like the top, principally New York based law firms, but it also includes some non-New York firms that, and I think this is largely true in terms of the way people think about it, that all somehow, through some machination of the antitrust laws, have figured out a way to pay everyone the same, pay associates the same starting salary year after year. So it's also used to categorize kind of, are you at one of the top firms that's paying like the top of the market associate salaries?
So I have a question about the hours. And so Jake, I am very good friends with his wife, who I adore. And she on Instagram, a lot of the time would have, it would be like a joke where it would be like, follow the iPad or like find the Apple, because Jake is working a lot. And so I know that the hours, it's similar probably to investment banking where it's like M&A hours are intense, right? You work a lot. And so I wanted to, I guess, talk about that. But what I think is really interesting too, as like a follow-up, is my understanding is there's a lot more women in law than in finance. And I feel like a lot of the reasons that people would sometimes throw out is that in finance, the hours are not sustainable to having a family. But and not that it's impossible to have a family and work in finance. We've had multiple conversations with people who have. But I just think it's very interesting that there are so many more women in law. And I would assume the hours are pretty similar. So I'm just wondering, are the people in law doing something right?
Maybe I'll take a stab at this first. I actually think that the transactional practices, like what Jake and I do, the numbers probably track finance, frankly.
Do they?
And it is an issue that we are grappling on large corporate law firms to address the problem of exactly that question of sustainability and how you can create space, because the nature, it's the same dynamics, right? Like you might wake up in the morning and your slate is clear, and at 4 p.m. something blows up and somebody wants to launch a transaction the next day, or in my world, or the equivalent in Jake's world, and like that's the evening, right? And it's like the unpredictability of it, the long hours, like those factors are inherent in the practice and they're hard to grapple with in that discussion. I think more broadly, right, there are areas of practice in the law, because law is so diverse, which are more conducive to a stable schedule or at least predictability. And even if the hours are long, you get to structure the hours a little bit more to say, okay, like there's a defined endpoint of the day. Here's when I pick it back up. Here's when I know what the next thing coming up is. That's just not there in our practice. And that's something that we're very committed to from the perspective of retaining women, supporting the promotion and succession of women in our field. It's something that we're talking about constantly and trying to think about how to really address it.
Roshni, I have a question. To what extent is there a gradient based on seniority for those hours and that unpredictability? Because in the investment banking world, the large critique is that, well, listen, even if you're working, whatever it is, 80, 100, 120-hour weeks as an analyst and associate, there is a light at the end of the tunnel that by the time you make managing director, your hours are much more under your control and are much more manageable. But I feel like that may not be the case, actually, that it's less of a grind at the junior levels in law, and that if anything, the hours and the demands may pick up as you get more senior within the firm. Is that a misconception on my part? What's the truth to that?
So it's certainly the hours of a junior corporate lawyer, I think, are similar to a junior banker. I actually don't think that there's much difference in that.
Okay.
And again, you don't control your schedule. Like, you're waiting for somebody to tell you what to do. And so obviously, as you get more senior, you have more control. And control, I think, is what's key to the balance, right? Being able to say, okay, I'm going to do this then. Here's how I'm going to plan my day to support having that life outside of work and creating some more sustainability in the hours. But I also think as you get more senior, right, it's a client service industry, and when your client calls, you're dropping everything in that moment. And so it's, again, because of the unpredictability, there's just an element of that doesn't change over time and in some ways intensifies. But again, because you're more senior and because you have that control, you really are able to carve out time in different ways. And I think that's probably the biggest difference. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Jake.
I agree. I mean, I think you do get a little more control as you, certainly once you become a partner and a more senior partner. I think it's not that different, honestly, than being a senior investment banker. I mean, I spent a lot of time working with partners and MDs at banks, and the good ones work very hard. I mean, it's the nature of the business. I mean, you need to be doing deals to stay relevant, right? You have to be very active. I think you do get a little more control. I would just, on the gender imbalance thing, I think I agree with Roshni. I think it's probably not that dissimilar to investment banks. I do think, firms, I know our firm is, and Davis Polk are making a real concerted effort to move in the right direction. I think Roshni's frankly a perfect example. She's, a superstar partner at one of the top New York firms with 2 kids, and she manages it, and it's not easy, but I think if you compare the numbers now to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I mean, my stepmom was one of the earliest prominent M&A partners at Skadden, and 30 years ago, you could count on one hand the number of people like her.
Yeah.
And much more needs to be had, but there's been progress at least.
Oh, that's so cool.
We've talked about this term partner a lot. And, I always think of partner as the brass ring that you're seeking in a legal career. Again, from the world of finance where things are very structured and there's almost like a military style progression from analyst to associate, VP, SVP, whatever you want to call it at your bank to MD. What's the progression like and the timeline and the milestones that you need to hit going from associate to partner? And maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like it's a much more fluid thing. Like it's not X number of years or X number of deals under your belt. It's like, how much do people like you? I don't know. And I'm really curious to understand the process.
So I think the tracks do vary, like you said, and it is like, right, you go from associate to partner, and those are the 2 delineations, like that's what it is. And the tracks really vary from 8 years, 10 years. In some practice areas, they're getting longer, and it's just kind of the nature of the practice, and there's no one defined path anymore. I also think there's a little bit of a revolving door in certain practice areas where you might go do something else and then you come back as a partner. So I don't think there's any one defined path. I think probably in corporate law, there's some more standardization, but it's varied. And it's fluid, right? You start off as a junior associate. And again, as we talked about earlier, as a corporate lawyer, this is your training ground. The first couple of years, you're really learning the practice of law. You're learning your specialization. You're learning the substance, but also how you want to practice. You're building that skill set of your style. You're observing. You're kind of trying things on. You're picking and choosing. You're developing who you are as a lawyer. And then you get into like those middle years, and you're managing transactions. You're building leadership skills. You're building external facing skills vis-a-vis clients. And again, you're continuing to build that substantive knowledge because that doesn't really end. And then you get to senior associate. And at that point, right, like you need to show people that you can function as a partner before anyone is going to make you a partner. And so it's really stepping into that role and taking on that position. We're talking in a transactional setting, obviously. I think litigation is very different, but you're taking on that role and then eventually get to the point where you're part of that discussion. But it's a gradual process. Most people don't know that they want to make partner in a law firm when they walk through the door, and that's something that happens over time. Jake may have known, actually.
But I knew you were going to make partner.
Yeah. But, it happens over time, and the metrics by which you're evaluated change over time. and you're needing to adapt. You're showing different skills. You need to show a range of people those skills because, again, for most partnerships, it's a collective voting process. And so there's a lot of different elements that go into it. And kind of as you said, it is a little bit fluid.
It's not a mechanical decision, right? It's not like, have I checked these 10 boxes? Great, I'm going to make partner. I mean, it's kind of like becoming an MD at a bank, except it's, in some ways, it's more like becoming a partner at Goldman Sachs when it was a partnership, right? Or actually, Goldman Sachs still elects partners.
It still is,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, it still is. It's just, it's a public company, but it's still a partnership. But they're qualitative evaluations, right? It's both technical skills, but also, are you functioning like a partner? Can you run a matter by yourself? Do you connect with clients? How will you advance as a partner? And then I would just add that it's difficult when you're looking at firms as a young lawyer to pick up on this, but firms are very different and the partnership structures are very different across different firms. Some firms have non-equity partners and have a tier of non-equity partners and a tier of equity partners, and the non-equity partners have the title, but they're really sort of salaried, whereas the equity partners are sharing in the residual profits of the firm. Other firms only have equity partnerships. The way they compensate partners may be different between different firms. Some firms are much more of what I think of as sort of an investment banking model, like an eat what you kill model. Others are much more, you kind of pool everything and then split it up based on seniority or some combination of factors. So that varies across firms.
And is there, because I had never heard of this, because this is not really the case in the finance world, that there's like a buy-in. So when you become partner, and maybe this is just in the TV shows, that when you become a partner, you have to write a check. What was it in Suits? They like announced that he's a partner and they're like, did you bring the check for me? Right? Is that still a thing, or does it vary by firm, or how does that whole buy-in work? And then I assume you get your equity partnership. But like, is that still a thing, or is that just in the TV shows?
It's still a thing, whether you actually have to cut a check or the firm
or it's just taken out of your comp that year.
Yeah. But it basically means if you're a partner, you are an owner of a business. It's a business organized as a partnership instead of a corporation. But so you receive partnership interest, which is the equivalent to stock in a company. Yep. And you make what's called a capital contribution to acquire that. So that's what people mean when they say buy-in. I think in some firms, you actually have to write a check. In a lot of firms, somebody in accounting does some math and you get paid a little less at the end of the
year. Got it.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd love to drill down a little bit into the specifics of what you are actually doing when you are liaising with these bankers and with your clients all day long. Can you walk us through the process of delivering your services to a client? Like, what's an example of, hey, okay, we're doing an M&A transaction. What are we calling Jake for? We are doing a debt issuance. What are we calling Roshni for? And who's calling you and what are they asking for? And what are you delivering where you say like, yes, that was a slam dunk?
It is a great question. I mean, what we do is really not cookie cutter. Kind of every deal is different. Every experience is different. But we are involved early on in structuring deals. So I want to merge with this company. What's the best way to structure it? We could be the acquirer. We could be the target. We could structure it as a direct merger, as something called a reverse triangular merger. There's a lot of different structures.
I've never heard that before.
I've only heard of RMTs. It's reverse triangular merger.
Yeah, RMTs are very complicated, but all of these have different tax implications. They have different stockholder approval requirements. So we're analyzing that. We are negotiating the key terms other than price, which the investment bankers, will be involved in negotiating. But
so you guys are the ones who are figuring out whether it's going to be 50-50 cash and stock, or you're going to be the ones figuring out, hey, this is going to be like the CEO compensation?
The mix of consideration is more of an investment banker, but we will be involved in saying if it's 50-50 stock, you need a stockholder vote. If it's 75-25, you don't. And if it's 50-50 stock, should we have a cash stock election? Should everybody get the same, a fixed exchange ratio and a fixed amount of cash? And what's the difference? And we would be more involved in, on what's the CEO's arrangement going to be going forward? What are the deal protections going to be? What is there a break fee if the deal falls apart in certain circumstances? What are the covenants we're going to agree to? What are the closing conditions? What's the antitrust level of efforts that's required? Is there a reverse break fee if the deal gets blocked on antitrust ground? So we'll negotiate all of that. And then I would say a lot of what we do, especially as you become a partner, it's all that, but it's more strategic advice. It's not dissimilar to what a senior banker does. What are the commercial issues here that really matter? Like crystallizing, what are the 10 most important issues here? What can we live without? What matters? How should you go about approaching this target in a way that's most likely to get the deal done in the way that you're going to be happy with? And it's not an accident.
Like a consulting role in so many ways.
In some ways, I mean, consultants, in my experience, they only get involved in M&A after the deal's basically signed and done, and they're working on integration stuff.
And figuring out the redundancies. They're figuring out how much in synergies, aka
who's getting
like
fired,
who's getting
how much
fired.
Yeah, we don't fire anyone as lawyers. I want to be clear, but it's a lot like
lawyers are the good guys in this case.
There's a lot of similarities at a senior level between what a lawyer does and what an investment banker does in terms of strategic advice. And I don't think it's an accident that if you look at a lot of senior bankers, I know this was the case at Merrill when I was there, a lot of them are former M&A lawyers. I mean, I think that happens less and less, in part because I think it used to be the case that being an investment banker was a lot more lucrative than being a lawyer, and there's been more of a convergence there, that's my sense. But there's still plenty of lawyers who become bankers later in life.
What's that path that you've seen from law to finance? What does that look like for colleagues or peers of yours that you've seen?
It tends to be, for us, I mean, Roshni might have a different experience on the capital market side. It happens less than it used to. I've seen it happen more in the activism space, actually.
Yeah.
We do a lot of activism defense, takeover defense work. And
meaning you have a Bill Ackman or a Peltz or whoever who's like trying to buy stake in a company to sway them to do something. And
Right.
So you work on the defense and then you go over there and figure out how to circumvent all the defenses you built up.
Yeah, sometimes we only do the defense side, but some firms do both. So there's a little bit of that in terms of people go over to a bank and do kind of the same thing on the investment banking side. But Roshni, you might see different.
I mean, it's similar strategy, or a lot of capital markets lawyers actually go kind of in-house on the business side and are doing strategy and corporate development because it's a similar skill set.
So they go into call it a Disney.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And actually, sorry, but before, because you had touched on compensation, what is and again, you don't have to disclose any personal secrets or anything, but I guess just ranges. What is the starting salary for an associate? And then what is the range that someone could expect if they become a partner at a big law? What are some of the ranges that people could expect? Or is it so wide because it's you get the profit sharing that it could be too wide? But I'm just curious, relative to banking, how it compares.
It is pretty wide. I think the starting salary these days at big law, I think is for first year associates about $225,000, something like that.
Is that base or all in?
That's base, and then you could get a bonus on top of that. At some firms, the bonuses are very high. At most firms, bonuses are not relative to base. They're not as high as they would be at investment banks.
Got it.
So it's higher base, lower bonus, but all in comp tracks somewhat similarly at the associate level.
Consistent with the general principle that lawyers are more risk averse than people going into finance.
Makes sense.
It's heavily weighted towards the base. And then it kind of scales up from there. And then in terms of partner comp, it really depends on the firm and the way they compensate partners and how the firm does.
Right.
But, I would say probably comparable to investment banks.
So I feel when people ask, it's 1 to 5 million is sort of what you expect as a banker. But then if you're the head of the group, it can continue to go up from there. So it can vary.
Or if you're in Europe versus America where you've got bonus cap issues and things like that, there's obviously divergences.
Yeah. And we're also in a little bit, I think, of a pivot point within the legal industry because and this has gotten a lot of press, but there's been a lot of poaching of talent between law firms that never used to happen on the same scale. And that happens, at investment banks all the time, right? People jump from one bank to another. you know,
And there's
historically
like no
that
hard
didn't
feelings
happen.
in investment banking. It's like, I'm working on it's, Goldman, whatever.
It's just,
like, yeah,
right. It's part
it's a
understood
given.
that that's how you
Yeah.
do it. You just
But
jump
that's not
around.
how it is in law. It's like a scandal.
Historically, that's not how it's been. I mean, really, in the last couple of years, and especially right now, you're seeing a lot more firms that are trying to build practices in areas where they're not historically as strong, paying a lot of money for talented partners of other firms. So there's more of a convergence, I think, as I said, over the last few years than probably there used to be.
You hang out with bankers long enough, you start to become like them.
I hope not.
Roshni, I have a specific question for you, and if you're uncomfortable answering this, please let me know. But we get so many questions from women who want to be senior in the industry and don't know how to make it work or are nervous about making it work. Can you speak to the support structures that you have in place as a mom of two, you said, to be able to do your job with these hours? I know that there's so many other moms out there who would benefit tremendously from you sharing what's worked and what hasn't.
Yeah, so I love this question, and it's one that I really feel like it's important to be honest about. And I think people are like, oh, like really, you can do it all, and you can have work-life balance. Like nothing is going to be in perfect equipoise at any given time, right? Like it's a roller coaster doing this job, and I love the fact that I get to do this job. I get to do something that's so fulfilling to me, and then I actually get my kids are like the greatest joy in my life, and being able to do both of them is not easy, but it's wonderful, and I rely on a lot of support to do it. I have a wonderful husband who's also a partner at a law firm, but is very supportive, and we constantly are balancing our schedules. And it's like a game of Tetris, but we figure it out. We have a great nanny who's really important to making it all work. My in-laws live in the city, and that's helpful when we need like emergency childcare because something has blown up or both of our travel schedules intersect and we're away at the same time. We have a lot of support in place, and that's really essential to making it work. And you also kind of to like roll with it a little bit, right? Like not every day is going to be perfect. Some days the kids are the priority because they're sick or something's going on and they necessarily have to be. Other days work is the priority. And, I might not make it home for bedtime or I have to travel or something's going on. You kind of have to like ease into that and be okay that, not every day is going to be perfect in any given space, but together you're making it all work. It's like an ongoing process where you're trying to make it work and recognizing that it'll get easier as the kids get older, but also these are the days where you want to maximize everything, both from a work and a kid perspective, but a lot of support and help goes into it. And outsourcing what you can. That's hard for me to like give up control over things, but that's that it works.
No, that's so true. I appreciate your candor on that front because I think that that's something that so many people, men and women, struggle with. Is if you are someone who's a perfectionist enough to be really successful in your career, you want to apply that same level of control to all aspects of your life. And it's like, okay, at a certain point, just like get takeout every night, right? Like just accept that that's going to be our lives or whatever it is, right? Like, yeah.
Well, and actually along those, Well, no, and I was going to say along those lines, I mean, Jake, you have twins who are young. So I guess same kind of question. I mean, how have you guys been doing it?
Well, I have an amazing wife who's just a phenomenal mom and does a lot. It does more than I do. But I do try to be there as often as I can. And again, I think I had kids, I wouldn't say late in life, but I was a partner when we had our kids. And that made it a little bit easier in terms of controlling my schedule. And I definitely did shift things around. Like I try to get home for bedtime, maybe not every night, but multiple nights a week. And I'm there with them in the morning. And that doesn't always work. I mean, if you're in the middle of a call, I'm flying to Texas for a board meeting today, so I'm not going to be there tomorrow. But you shift things in ways that you can control to spend more time with your kids. And as Rich said, at the end of the day, you have to make this job work for you on a personal level. I mean, you'll never be able to do what we do if you're miserable and if you feel like you're not spending time with your family. And I think it is doable. I mean, I was lucky. I grew up with a role model who, my dad did this, and he was probably around less in the early years. I don't remember him as well, but by the time, I was a little bit older, we were spending a lot of time together, and he was always prioritizing that over work whenever possible. So I think it is doable. It's not easy. Roshni is a total champion to do what she does, but it does get easier as you get a little more senior.
Yeah. All right. And again, I know, Jake, you need to run and go fly off somewhere. So this will be our last question. I want to end with something that's kind of fun. So Suits is obviously like the number one TV show on television these days. And for our generation, right, it was Law and Order. I actually was obsessed with The Good Wife. I don't know if you guys ever watched that, and Boston Legal. But I'm curious how much of what's depicted in these shows actually jives with reality, if at all. It seems that in Suits, it just seems that it's written for maximum narrative impact. And a lot of the plot lines make absolutely no sense. And so I was just curious, is there any show that like is a little more true to the realities of the law?
Yeah, I love the Suits plot lines are like totally insane. Like one day they're like handling some massive civil litigation, and then they're closing an M&A transaction. It's that's not how this works. Like these are super subspecialties. But I guess that's like that's what's the entertainment value in it. Like our jobs, if somebody were to watch them, like maybe not that exciting from day to day.
Yeah.
They're much better looking on that show.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. No.
Other than the bald guy. No, but
Lewis.
That's the main fallacy of that show, is that you could be a litigator and a deal lawyer and you go from one to the other. That doesn't happen. Maybe that happened 50 years ago, but that doesn't happen today.
What about paralegals? I feel like they're like, oh, the paralegal is all of a sudden the hero who saves the day. What do paralegals do? Is there upward mobility for them?
Paralegals, I think it's a little different at different firms. Some firms have kind of career paralegals where you could be a paralegal for 30 years. Mm-hmm. At our firm, and I'm not sure how Davis Polk does it, our paralegals come for 2 to 3 years. And so it's almost like being an analyst, and then they usually go to law school or they go,
got it,
become a consultant. So, I think you get a little bit of exposure to what we do. It's not an easy job by any means. I mean, you're kind of on law firm associate hours in some ways and doing some of the toughest tasks, but you do get some exposure. So my wife did it for a year before going to law school. And I don't know, Roshni, that's what it's like at Davis Polk.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like a career track program. You do it for a couple of years and then you go to law school.
And actually, sorry, I have one last tiny question. So Jen and I recently read The Caesar Palace Coup by Max Frooms and Sujit Indap. And in that book, everything would like hinge on a comma and like how you read, some clause in some legal document with some comma. Does that happen in real life? Or like
the gotcha moment.
True.
Like, you forgot the semicolon. Therefore, the whole deal is invalid and we win.
Like, does that happen? Or is that just like...
it happened in that case. I would say that's an extreme example. But what does happen is the words matter in contracts. And in 9 out of 10, probably even 95 out of 100 cases, everything's friendly, nothing blows up, and no one ever really looks that hard at the words after the fact. But sometimes, more in M&A transactions than in capital markets transactions, something goes wrong, a buyer decides it wants to get out of a deal, or there's some big post-closing indemnity claim, and you end up in litigation. And that's when people pore over every single detail in the contract, looking for every possible argument to get out of the deal or force the other side to stick with the deal. And there you do get disputes over, usually it's not commas, but what did this phrase mean? What did this provision mean? And then you get litigators second guessing what you did at 3 a.m, when you were trying to get a deal done. So but the lesson from, I think, those types of cases is that the words matter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that you need the best lawyers on the way in, not for when things go well, but in case things go badly.
Totally.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate both of you guys. And so again, I know, Jake, you also are flying off somewhere. So I'm
so
thrilled that we were able to make this happen. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you guys so much for your time. Go have a safe flight. Thank you guys. It was wonderful meeting you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.